And then I think, okay, you got a guy who is in jail right now for attempted murder and also animal cruelty and illegal animal trafficking all over the country. Well, he would have a use for a Chinese smuggling network too, wouldn't he? All these things happening within a 20-mile radius of this little town of Lindsay, Oklahoma. For whatever reason, the Tiger King liked this guy's hat. He always wore this hat with the guy's name on it.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us on the latest episode of the Everyday Investor podcast. Today, I'm catching up with the one, the only, the nobody special, Jack Gamble. How are you, Jack?
I'm very good. Thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate the opportunity.
Hey, no problem. Let's get stuck straight into it. The failure of First National Bank of Lindsay, Oklahoma. I know with most of my audience, that might be like the first times they've heard that string of words, but it was a non-event for mainstream media. Yet you uncovered a Fargo-esque Jack Reacher style story in plain sight and at a high level so that people can actually go away and watch the video themselves. What does the Tiger King have to do with the CCP, a $60 million bank loss, a bankrupt school, and suspicious deaths? How did you find all this stuff out?
Yeah, I tell you, that story was just nutty. And as I was researching that, I just kept saying to myself, no, right? No. No. The First National Bank of Lindsay failed in October of last year in 2024. It was initially, if it was covered at all, very little attention. Some state and local media covered it. Did not even get a mention on a national level. The few people like on YouTube who covered it were very quick to dismiss it as an extension of the Silicon Valley bank failures that started in 2023 due to, unrealized losses from U.S. Treasuries. When I see a bank failure, the first thing I usually do is just go pull the bank's balance sheet. And so I did that. And right away, I realized I look at the hit to the deposit insurance fund. It was about a $43 million hit to the deposit insurance fund. And this bank had a little bit over $100 million in total assets at the time. So just way too much money went missing to be explained away by unrealized losses on treasuries. Right. So that was right away I knew. And even the FDIC announcement, it mentioned suspected fraud was involved. So I knew there was more to this story right away. I spent some time digging into it. And one of the first things I did, I realized, okay, this much money goes missing. I look at the town, I look it on the map, tiny little town in flyover country. So I go to the Facebook page, the local Facebook page. That much money goes missing in a small town. People are going to be talking. And of course, I go to the local Facebook page and there are people talking about this, but there's also this very concerted effort to suppress any discussion of the bank failure. People, and a lot of people started mentioning grief and things like that. I'm like, grief? We're talking about a bank failure. So upon further research, I go to the bank's Facebook page. I realized the bank's vice president, about 2 to 3 weeks before the bank had failed, the bank's vice president, a very well-respected and liked man in the community, had taken his own life. So right away, okay, there's obviously something big and dark going here. Started doing more and more research, realized, okay, money has a funny habit of going missing in this town. The local utility had lost millions of dollars. The school district was millions of dollars behind budget. The town had fired its auditor a few years earlier, so nobody was looking at the town finances. So that, this town is just rife with corruption. And so people were using this family's grief to try to suppress any discussion of happenings at the bank. And, people are like, hey, my business just lost money. All the insured depositors or uninsured depositors didn't get bailed out like with the big banks in Silicon Valley, right? They got all their money back, even the people above the insurance limits, because we can't let tech bros in Silicon Valley lose money. But sleepy little town in flyover country, we don't care about them. They'll lose money. We don't care. So, businesses aren't making payroll now. People's lives are destroyed here. And I see that much money missing. I have to go look. It appears that the bank's CEO was involved in this. To this day, he's the only one who's been indicted. But I look at the bank CEO, I find his Facebook page. The guy drives a fancy Jeep Wrangler. It's a little souped up with a fancy paint job. He's got a little cabana in his backyard. He's got an above ground pool in his backyard. This is not where up to $60 million went. Right? You had 10 million in bank capital went up in smoke, 7 million in uninsured deposits, and a $43 million hit to the deposit insurance fund. $60 million went missing. It didn't go into this guy's above ground pool. My initial thoughts was crypto might have been where the money disappeared, because there was a similar bank failure in Kansas a few months before this one, and that was the CEO had embezzled the money and lost it in a pig butchering scam. But then I look at where this town is, right along the I-35 corridor in Oklahoma, which is a major drug smuggling corridor, major human trafficking corridor. And then I start reading, okay, drug trafficking in Oklahoma. I find out that illegal marijuana grow operations is a massive industry in Oklahoma, and it's been virtually completely taken over by Chinese triads, organized crime.
Wow.
Okay, so I start looking a little bit more. I did a video a few days after the bank failure, and I reached out. In that video, I made an open call to Lindsay residents to come forward and talk. It's like, I know something is going on in this town. I see them trying to quiet you. Let's talk. And more than a dozen people in town came forward. They all requested anonymity. They didn't want their names out there. It's a small town. People talk. Several common themes, common names. A guy that ran a car shop that doing fancy race cars was mentioned. A guy that ran a trucking company was very consistently mentioned. These guys had extensive criminal backgrounds for fraud, embezzlement, money laundering, weapons charges, domestic abuse charges. Right along a drug smuggling corridor, tens of millions of dollars missing. And then I found out there had been a big bust in this town just a few months before the bank failed. An illegal grow operation was broken up. They caught a guy using a fake Amazon van to smuggle marijuana out of state, which is illegal. Some of the residents had mentioned that the Chinese were all over town, that they were using straw grows, where basically a Chinese gangster hires an American to obtain the license to legally grow marijuana in the state, but then the Chinese gangster runs it, and he runs it like a criminal enterprise. Straw ownership. Yeah. Very common. So, I go looking on this, and then as I'm looking into these properties where it's taking place, I'll try to tie this into Tiger King without giving away the whole video, but I pull loan records, I pull property records, criminal histories, and I find a dotted line to a very prominent local businessman who ties into the Tiger King. For whatever reason, the Tiger King liked this guy's hat. He always wore this hat with the guy's name on it. And I'm like, oh, that's a crazy coincidence. But the more I realize it, and the more research I do, I realize there are 4 distinct businesses that Chinese triads are involved in the Western Hemisphere. One of them is money laundering, check. The other one is fentanyl precursors sold to the Mexican cartels, check. They traffic right along the I-35 corridor. The other is human trafficking, check. The Chinese grow operations use borderline slave labor, smuggled in Chinese immigrants to work in forced labor conditions at these illegal grows. And the 4th was the illegal wildlife trade. And then I think, okay, you got a guy who is in jail right now for attempted murder and also animal cruelty and illegal animal trafficking all over the country. Well, he would have a use for a Chinese smuggling network too, wouldn't he? All these things happening within a 20-mile radius of this little town of Lindsay, Oklahoma. Yeah. That one was a marathon. I worked on that story for over a year.
I'm not surprised.
And it was hard to put that one down. It really was.
Oh man, I could tell it. It takes a lot out of you, but you just keep on putting them out, which blows me away. Why hasn't the mainstream media caught on to this? Why is this not a Netflix series? Why did it take nobody special from your neck of the woods to actually discover this?
Well, hey, Netflix, I'm willing to talk if you're listening. Throw me a number, right? There's a guy named Mitch Vexler, who works at a channel called Real Estate Mindset, good friend of mine. He made the comment when the bank first failed, there's too big to fail, and then there's too small to care. And this was too small to care. Just that was it. Nobody cared. And the whole time I was working on this story, and it kind of took on a life of its own. It was in the back of my mind. Nobody's going to care about this. It's just this little town. It wasn't that much money that disappeared. A lot for you or me, but in the context of Wall Street banks, it's a rounding error. Yeah. I was hoping people would care about it. I was hoping that the story would capture people. I think tying it into Netflix, I was able to get a little bit more of that. I mean, that was like, okay, now we can pick people's curiosity, and maybe these people in this town will have a chance now because, I mean, these people have just been bled dry. Their utility rates have tripled. By the way, stolen electricity is another calling card of these Chinese illegal grow operations. They bankrupt local utilities by stealing electricity and water. Their schools, their taxes have gone up. Their electric bills have gone up. Money has now gone missing in the bank. These people don't really have a chance, and they think nobody cares about them, and they think it's never going to change. So I'm hoping this story leads to some good.
I'm hoping also. And that's kind of one of the reasons why I thought I want to bring this up with you, even though it's technically not really for the everyday investor. How can this help you become a better investor? I think it's really important to understand the overall ecosystem that we operate in, because we're kind of led to believe that regulators, banks, they're kept very separate from organized crime. And clearly with this example, it feels like there is no differentiation between banks, regulators, and organized crime. Not here anyway. And I'm just wondering, when we see sometimes they fight, sometimes they cooperate, but almost never do they act for the benefit of the everyday person. Are we at a point now where we just can't trust these financial institutions really anymore? Are we already there?
I think yes and no. I think you can make the argument in both directions on this one. Like I mentioned this in the video about Oklahoma. This does tie into that massive settlement and fine against TD Bank from a year ago.
Right.
It was a $3 billion fine for money laundering violations at TD Bank. It was the biggest fine any bank has ever been charged by the U.S. regulators. It's a Canadian bank, but the biggest fine the U.S. has ever inflicted, and that was for allowing money laundering of Chinese organized crime cash deposits while bank employees were being bribed. And my research in Oklahoma found that these Chinese triads are run by networks in New York that run the money for them. So I think this ties into that as well. So there is that angle. The regulators are not totally asleep at the wheel,
Right.
but we do have a history in the United States of the government alphabet soup, if you will, our many three-lettered agencies operating with conflicting priorities. Like during the Cold War and the cocaine cartels in South America, you had the DEA was fighting them while the CIA was running interference for them, because the CIA was using the cartels to fund guerrilla wars that were opposed to the communist governments in South America at the time. So it's not so paranoid to think that the government agencies may be involved here, or may at least some may be looking the other way, or some maybe even using these networks as assets in some kind of grand scheme of things to fight the Chinese on a global scale, maybe, gathering information, allowing these networks to operate so that they can learn from them.
Yeah.
I did a similar video about a company called Hyperscale Nexus about a year and a half ago. This was an AI company that was merging with a penny stock weed company in the United States called American Cannabis. And long story short, in this one, I found out that this was a money laundering front for the Kinahan cartel, which is the biggest fentanyl cartel in Europe. The U.S. government had a $5 million bounty on Kinahan's head and his criminal enterprise. And this is the way I found that out. I actually had an anonymous tip from a viewer, and we found out that the CEO of this company that was merging with the weed farm was, number one, operating under a fake name. His real name, he said his name was Thomas Stray. His real name was Thomas Oye. He's a convicted money launderer from Norway. And he shared an office in Dubai with Daniel Kinahan. Daniel Kinahan used to be the CEO of MTK Global, a big boxing empire. His organization represented Tyson Fury, the former heavyweight champion. He was kicked out of boxing a few years ago, sanctioned by the U.S. Treasury. And so this AI company was a front for laundering the Kinahan's money. They were smuggling GPUs into China using this company as a front to do it. And there's a suspicion that Kinahan himself may actually be operated by U.S. intelligence. Now, he's now believed to be hiding in Iran, and he's believed to be laundering money for Hezbollah and for the Iranians. And, shortly after an article came out saying that there was suspicion that Kinahan was being handled by the CIA, a few months after that, there was the simultaneous explosion of several thousand pagers in Lebanon.
Wow.
That Israeli intelligence carried out. They actually decapitated Hezbollah in a day. It was one of the most successful intelligence operations in history. All these pagers blew up simultaneously, and Israeli intelligence had infiltrated the company that made the pagers, found out where the pagers were going for Hezbollah, put explosives in the batteries, and then detonated them all simultaneously. This was last summer this happened.
Yeah.
And, a guy who would have access to the information to make something like that happen would be the guy who launders their money. And so that made me do a double take that maybe, Kinahan, another example where we're allowing these heinous crimes to happen because of some other priority, whether it's counterterrorism, counter-communism in the Cold War, or combating the Chinese today.
Staying on that Chinese thread, I know there have been some allegations and some, factual events that have happened here in New Zealand where I live now. And I kind of wonder just how active the Chinese government is in supporting criminal activity around the globe, especially in Western nations. And I just want to know if do you have any comment around that, around just how intentional the Chinese party is in trying to infiltrate the US to destabilize it and cause fentanyl deaths, for example?
I know the century of humiliation is a very common phrase among Chinese, and it's used to basically say things like fentanyl, shipping mass shipments of fentanyl precursors to the United States and killing all these people. It's just giving the West a taste of their own medicine because of the opium wars that were used to destabilize China in order to keep Chinese a vassal state and manipulate them for trade. So, and then, you could rope in the Japanese invasions and the way the Japanese treated the Chinese during World War II and the lead up to World War II. And, the Japanese are now on our side effectively. So I think these past historical atrocities are used to make excuses for destabilizing operations now, where to them, yeah, it's a terrible thing, but it's justified because hundreds of years ago, this was done to them.
Not that I would excuse it, but I totally understand it. And then therefore, by extension, do you think that the Trump administration kind of putting pressure on Venezuela right now and in the name of stamping out this drug trade, would you take that at face value, or is there something else going on, like a revival of the Monroe Doctrine? I don't know if you kind of follow that space much at all, but do you kind of feel like, take it at face value with what's going on there, or is there another story with the U.S. and Venezuela right now?
Monroe Doctrine, absolutely. I mean, that is something that has, anytime anybody has tried that, the U.S. has stepped right up to the plate. So, yeah, I think that's very real. The drug thing, I think, is covered. It's oil in Venezuela. It's 100% oil. We just pulled out of a conflict in the Red Sea that our Navy performed admirably, and our allied Navy ships that were there performed admirably. None of our ships were hit. We got close. They came close pretty, an American carrier had to maneuver so quickly that an F-18 rolled off the elevator. That they came close to hitting our ships. And we were shooting down $20,000 Iranian Shahed drones with $2 million SM-2 interceptors. Yeah. The math doesn't work there for us. So, and we decided, hey, we're going through too many missiles. We can't make these missiles fast enough. We need them for a hypothetical confrontation in the South China Sea. So we won the battles, but lost the war in the Red Sea. I don't think there's any other way to look at that. We certainly didn't restore freedom of navigation. I mean, we put pressure on the Israelis to end the conflict there. And then the Yemenis said, okay, or the Houthis said, okay, since the slaughter has stopped, we'll stop shooting at ships. But we certainly didn't beat them into submission. Right. So that was all being done with Iranian equipment supplied by the Iranian regime. And the other major bottleneck in the Middle East is the Strait of Hormuz, where a quarter of the world's oil flows through every day. And so if it ever came to a global conflict, we would be unable to ensure freedom of navigation of the major oil choke points in the world. So we need another source of oil. And Venezuela has the largest oil deposits in the world by a huge margin. They're not producing it because if there's one thing socialism and its idiot cousin communism is very successful at doing, it's destroying a well-run operation. And so Venezuela's oil production is just absolutely in the toilet. Yeah. But if we are going to have this global conflict, which sadly looks increasingly inevitable, we better be able to keep the oil flowing. And I think that's got more to do with what's going on in Venezuela than the narco-terrorism angle.
Okay. Now let's just go back a little bit and upwards a little bit. Let's talk about the U.S. Federal Reserve. And in a recent video, you said, and I'll quote you verbatim here, I think this is correct, "I don't care what you call it, the Federal Reserve is printing money again. Yesterday, Chairman Powell announced that the central bank would buy up to $40 billion per month of short-term U.S. treasuries in order to maintain ample reserves. Plain English, burr." So hopefully I got that right. But after officially ending QT on December 1st, why is it that the Fed, and all central banks for that matter, seem to be so hell-bent on rescuing us from one crisis after another that they themselves help create?
I don't think it's us they're trying to rescue. I think they're trying to rescue themselves, right? The Cantillon effect, those closest to the money printer get the benefits first, those furthest from the money printer. Us is pretty far from the money printer. The,
Yeah,
the, the,
sadly.
the member banks that own the Federal Reserve are a hell of a lot closer to the money printer. So I think it's themselves that they are bailing out with QE.
Yeah.
Powell's using some pretty elaborate word salad to describe what they're doing. They're printing money and buying treasury bills with it. That's the simple way.
Yeah.
Why? What is it that they see? Obviously, they see a liquidity crisis coming. Powell mentioned April several times. That's tax day in the U.S.
Right.
Typically, liquidity strain around that time. A lot of transactions, repo usage tends to spike around a time like that. Now, we can't afford a liquidity crisis for any number of reasons. We've got private credit bubble in the U.S., commercial real estate bubble. We've got an AI bubble, a crypto bubble. I don't know if we'd call private equity a bubble, but we have more private equity firms than McDonald's in the United States now, and they're all sitting on assets that they can't sell, certainly not at valuations they advertise. We can't afford a liquidity crisis here, or at least they can't afford a liquidity crisis. I don't think the average American really cares about it because they're asset light. They're just trying to make ends meet at the end of the month, and they wouldn't mind their money becoming more valuable for a change.
True.
But I also think one thing they're worried about is the basis trade blowing up. And we've seen that a lot of people don't realize that's really what brought the Fed to their knees under COVID was the blow up in the basis trade, where it's the quintessential picking up pennies in front of a steamroller, where a hedge fund or some financial institution they'll buy a T-bill and then they'll sell the corresponding T-bill treasury or future against that treasury.
Yeah.
And the idea is to capture the arbitrage, right? They'll collect that little bit of time decay, and then eventually, as the two prices come back into alignment, they've made a fraction of a cent on the trade.
Right.
It's viewed as riskless or virtually riskless. And so what they do is they lever up like crazy, they buy a ton, borrow a ton of money, and they do this in huge quantities. And then those fractions of a cent in arbitrage that they're collecting becomes something real. And it works as long as you don't have a big spike in interest rates. When you have a spike in interest rates, those T-bills lose value.
Yeah.
And that's when the basis trade turns into picking up pennies in front of the steamroller to getting flattened by the steamroller. Right. And in 2020, in March of 2020 in particular, there was any number of firms were on death row about to blow up. And the Fed just pivoted instantly and started dumping money in to prevent that from happening.
Right.
So that's like a $2 trillion. Nobody even really knows how big the basis trade is. They estimate it's around $2 trillion. Right. But I think that's probably what's got them spooked. They're afraid of a spike in interest rates. I mean, they didn't just print. I mean, they also pulled the cap off of the limit for repurchase agreements. There was a $500 billion limit on how much repos could be how much liquidity could be injected in the market via repos, and they just got rid of that. And they were very quick to remind everybody it's unlimited now. We'll print as much money as you guys want in any given day. So something spooked them. I think it was the basis trade, to be honest with you.
Interesting. And this is kind of connected, I guess, then to that response. This is something that it's always been in the back of my head. I've never really heard anybody address this in the way that, or respond to this question or theory or idea in a way that really satisfies my curiosity. So I'll have a crack with you and see what you think. And feel free to put on your tinfoil hat in the background there if you need to, Jack. By the way, can people get a hold of these? Do they just go to your YouTube site and buy one of these?
Yep, I have my merch store. I like it's not just the conspiracy nuts anymore. We're making it normal. So yeah,
that's right.
If you're not a conspiracy theorist by now, you haven't been paying attention in this decade.
Yeah, use tinfoil, not Glad wrap every day. Yeah. All right. So September 16th to the 17th, I think it was 2019, overnight repo rates spiked from 2% to 10%, maybe even more. I'm not sure. But then in October, again, this is all still pre-COVID, they being the Federal Reserve, start buying $60 billion in treasuries to maintain ample reserves. And my question is, was the 2020 pandemic response actually the excuse rather than the cause? Was the repo crisis the trap, and did the Fed need a reason for massive intervention to prevent systemic collapse? What do you think, Jack?
That is a fine bit of tinfoil right there. Let me just say, that played a huge role in ultimately leading to my channel creation. I remember Repo Madness well. September 17th, 2019. I think it was arguably the most important day in our lives, and most people don't realize it. That was the day, in my opinion, that the runaway spending of the U.S. government finally caught up to them. They had literally borrowed all the money in the world, and there wasn't enough anymore.
Interesting.
And there was a big spike in those overnight lending rates, and everything was good. The unemployment rate was low. Stocks were at all-time highs. The economy was growing. Everything was good. And then all of a sudden, the Federal Reserve is printing $60 billion. And I didn't know a tenth of what I know now back then, but I knew enough back then to know something was majorly wrong there. That just doesn't smell right. And that you didn't get the answer in the mainstream financial press. It just wasn't out there. There was nothing but Fed speak and, oh, this is normal. And like you said, ample reserves. Sure, it's totally normal. I knew it wasn't normal. And that led me to YouTube. I mean, at this point, I'm already, in YouTube University. I just bought a big house. And so everything I need to learn how to do, to fix, to maintain, I'm on YouTube learning it. So I go to YouTube for the answers. Found a channel called Heresy Financial run by my friend Joe Brown, who I've since met and worked with, really smart guy. And he had a very good explanation that, just basically said they have borrowed too much. They literally borrowed all the money in the world, and now they need to make more and lend it to the government. This is a bailout of government spending. It's finally caught up with them. And, our whole life we've been hearing how we need to cut spending here in the States, and we always pay lip service to it, at least during election seasons, and then do nothing about it. So that was a very big event. And as far as, was that like the cause of COVID? What's the Hanlon's razor? Never. I'm paraphrasing
Occam's razor.
Well, Occam's razor is the simplest explanation, is usually the right one.
Oh, sorry.
Hanlon's razor is a little bit less known. It's never
attribute to malice.
Never attribute to malice that which can be explained by simple stupidity. I probably butchered the phrase there. Okay. You think about the kind of people, especially in a communist country where, there's a commissar in every boardroom, the kind of people who are promoted to positions of responsibility are the people who say the right things at meetings, not the people who get the results, not the people who do the job the best. And so I think it's, the disease, I think it's perfectly logical to expect that, number one, they never should have been doing this to begin with, but they did. Some idiot messed it up, and he probably walked the virus on the bottom of his shoe out the lab and infected the world with it. I think that's a perfectly reasonable explanation. That being said, the money printing excuse, I think that presented an opportunity for what they knew they needed to do. And I think that money printing would have happened one way or another, whether the vid came around or not. I do think they would have printed those trillions, because we learned that they had to in September of 2019. And, I saw that, and I started studying like crazy after that happened. And right around December of 2020, I started shorting the market big time, because I figured some big liquidity crisis was coming. Right. And I just kept shorting. And man, that trade did really well when the whole world went on lockdown.
Wow. Well done. And again, sitting down here in New Zealand, we saw the Reserve Bank of New Zealand engage in similar policies, funnily enough, as we saw in every other country. Yet I don't know how big the problem was in all these other countries, but it's almost like we had to administer the same cure despite the variation of the illness. And I'm talking about this on a financial level. The variation in the illness that we were suffering was very different to what was happening in the US. And so the only kind of explanation I have is that it's just to keep parity with the exchange rates and to keep things balanced within the global financial system. That's why these reserve banks had to administer the same response, even though they were completely nonsensical and uncalled for. Here in New Zealand, it triggered a mammoth property bull run, which we're still paying for today. One of the few property markets in the world, or in the Western world, I think, that is still paying for it today in the form of stubbornly high interest rates as they flush all that stuff out. But it is it's just so fascinating just how the mainstream media just doesn't touch this stuff. And it takes people like you to actually dig a little bit deeper, do a bit more research, and sound the alarm bell. So, once again.
Well, it's probably a good thing I didn't have my channel back then, because I don't think I would have survived 2020 and 2021. I think they would have taken my channel down. And it was kind of shocking how much the world went along with that. I mean, that was an ugly episode in human history, I think, and what we were willing to accept to be done to us in the name of safety. Even, to the point of ignoring the evidence of our eyes and ears. I think the powerful people in this world were shocked at what they were able to get away with.
Yeah.
Leading into that.
No, I think that's well said. And so, kind of linking the start of our conversation with that Lindsay banking event to the overall banking ecosystem, the boom bust cycle. I'll throw in there recent developments we've seen here in New Zealand, where a couple of banks have imposed mandatory device level tracking on mobile devices, as in the name of safety for AML reasons. You kind of say repeatedly, unbank yourself, and you also say things like, "I like the shiny." So for everyday investors that are keen to protect themselves in a system like this, where with mixed messaging and kind of gangster-like activity happening all around them, it seems, why silver? Why do you kind of talk about silver a lot on the channel?
So unfortunately, because the Keynesians run everything, there is no boom bust cycle. There is the boom and the print cycle. They don't let the bust happen, and the bust is healthy. The bust is vital to a thriving ecosystem. It's what works in nature, right? If a species thrives too much and reproduces too much, they overconsume the food supply. That species dies off to a more sustainable level. It keeps us honest. The Keynesians come in and print money every time that die off starts, and they never let the rot be removed. And so that's causes these endless asset bubbles. And because of the Cantillon effect and the money printing, the average wage earner is always furthest from the money printing. And so they never see the benefits, but they do see the increase in their cost of living. So the old pull yourself up by your bootstraps, just work hard and put whatever you have left into a savings account at the end of the day. And within a couple of years, you'll have enough money to buy a house and live the middle class dream. That doesn't work anymore. Yeah. And that's why we have entire generations, at least here in the States, that are just totally dejected. The dream of home ownership is gone. Nihilism runs rampant. An entire generation having the hope sucked out of them is a really painful thing to watch. And I'm seeing it. I see it in the comments every day. None of this matters. I'll never be able to own a house. I see it in young relatives, and it sucks. Yeah. So what are your choices? You can work your butt off just to see your savings eroded away in a savings account. You can go in their casino where they change the rules to suit themselves whenever they want. And you can, look at what they're doing with private credit and private equity right now, and how they're dumping all this stuff into people's 401ks, whether they realize it or not. Retirement accounts have become a dumping ground for the world's toxic sludge. You have an AI bubble, a speculative asset bubble. So, you could go into that and you could study all day and watch tickers all day. And maybe you want to do that. I mean, that's what I do. So a lot of people do that, and it's fine. But the average person doesn't want to do that and shouldn't have to. And so the way to get around that, if you don't want to be forced into the casino and play by rules that change anytime they want them to, then you have to put your savings somewhere else. And the logical choice there is gold and silver. And I also think that because financial repression is now the law of the land, and because the U.S. is so hopelessly indebted, the only choice is to make sure inflation runs above the rate of interest rates on the U.S. debt, right? That's the only way the U.S. government can stay solvent. If we ever allow the inflation rate to fall below the rate interest accumulates on our debt, then our debt is growing faster than we could ever pay it off, or God forbid, pay it off. Our debt is just growing faster than we can even service at that point. We can't even afford the servicing cost, let alone to pay it off. So they need to keep inflation hot in order to slowly devalue that 38 trillion in debt, which means the standard 60-40 portfolio probably isn't going to work great anymore, because that 40% is going to be losing money. It's going to be losing spending power. And that's why we got guys like Gunlock and guys like Dalio coming out this year calling for some pretty aggressive allocations to gold, 15 to 25%, when historically these guys might have been 5% tops. And that's coming out of the bond section of the portfolio. And it's because of negative real rates is driving that. And so that means a lot of money is going to be pouring into precious metals from your standard 60-40. And with that money pouring into precious metals, gold and silver, obviously the chief beneficiaries there. Now, earlier this year, the gold to silver ratio was very high. We went as high as 105 earlier this year. And at that point, I was screaming from the rooftop about silver. Like, silver is ready to rip here. Gold has had a massive run. Silver has sat it out. Silver's going to catch up. Yeah. And it has. Silver has more than doubled this year. Best performing asset class. Yeah. Now the gold to silver ratio has come from about 105 ounces of silver to equal the value of 1 ounce of gold down to about 67 and a half. Yeah. Which is closer to the average over my lifetime. The average of the last 45 years or so has been about 65, which is right about where we're at. So silver is now more in line with gold. I wouldn't be surprised to see gold start outperforming again here, at least over the last 10 years or so, this is when about that would happen.
Okay.
But even still, historically, over like the last 100 years, the average gold to silver ratio has been something more like 40-1. So silver is still relatively undervalued compared to gold. And I think both are going to continue to rally as more of the world allocates for safety against inflation, which I think is going to come ripping back, especially now that they're printing the money again.
Interesting. Okay. So that wasn't one of my questions I was thinking about asking you, but yeah, your general view on inflation is that you're kind of seeing that come back in full force because of the printing that's recommencing that no one's really that aware of.
I mean, they're printing and the crisis hasn't even started yet, right? I mean, we're only a couple points off all-time highs in the S&P here, and they're they're spinning up the money printers before the crisis now. It used to be response to the crisis. Now it's we might have one, so we're just going to go ahead and print. Inflation's still over 3% here in the States. They're not even pretending anymore.
That's crazy. And what do you think it's because of this? And maybe it's a narrative, maybe it's reality. Who knows? But with AI, is that new form of technology bringing in so much deflationary forces that they're anticipating that, trying to front run potential deflation?
None whatsoever.
Okay.
None whatsoever. I think AI is completely overhyped. Completely overhyped. There have been no productivity gains whatsoever. MIT did a study. 95% of AI pilots at American companies have failed to generate any return on investments. 95. Wow. I mean, products with 95% failure rates do not succeed. Yeah. And think about how much money we have spent on it. It's virtually all GDP growth in America now is data center construction. They're building these things everywhere. They're trying to build one in my hometown. There's signs all over town says, don't build no data center in my town.
Right.
This will go down in history as one of the most grotesque destructions of capital in history. And what do you get when you have, governments manipulating the money supply, suppressing interest rates? You get misallocation of capital. And there's never been a misallocation of capital quite like the AI bubble. We've never seen anything like it. I mean, they're spending all this money on GPUs that will last, if you ask Michael Burry, 4 years. If you ask Google, 6 years. They've got 6 years to make their money back on this stuff. It's already been 2.5, and they're still all losing money. So the only way they can keep operating is the endless influx of new investment capital. They're using round tripping, the same mechanism of vendor financing that they used during the dot-com bubble to inflate the build out of the backbone infrastructure for the internet and the dot-com bubble. It's the same tricks, the same hype machine.
Right. Just
the
really
similarities.
Quickly, just so we can define that round tripping. You can do it so much better than me. I barely understand it. Can you just explain that?
Round tripping is, simply put, you give money to your customer so your customer can afford to buy your product, right? They called it vendor financing, like Cisco and Sun Microsystems. They had all these finance arms where, my customer can't afford to buy my server. No problem. Call my finance guy. He'll arrange where you can borrow money. We'll lend it to you, and then you send it right to us to buy our servers. Right. And the problem was the dot-coms that were buying the servers couldn't afford, they didn't make any money, so they couldn't afford to pay that debt. And the debt all went up in smoke and they all went belly up. Yeah. Right now, they're calling it strategic investment. NVIDIA invested in 49 of their own customers in 2024. They gave them money. What do you think they did with it? They either rented or purchased NVIDIA GPUs with that money. Google and Amazon did it with Anthropic. Microsoft did it with OpenAI. Oracle did it with OpenAI. I mean, the deals with Oracle, I think it hit its peak. The bubble hit its top in September and shortly thereafter with that ridiculous reporting of remaining performance obligations by Oracle in their September quarter. And everybody's like, OpenAI has promised to spend $1 trillion on our data centers. And at the time, nobody said, does OpenAI have $1 trillion? No, they don't. OpenAI, they lost $8 billion on $5 billion in revenue last year. Don't quote me on the numbers, but we're in the ballpark. They went from $5 billion in total revenue, an $8 billion loss. Where are they going to get $1 trillion to rent Oracle's data centers between now and 2030? They won't. But Oracle reported it as if it was money in the bank and people bought the stock. I think that'll be remembered as peak stupidity in this bubble.
Okay. Fascinating. Well, it's not the first time that you've called something before it happened. So the Bitcoin piece, right? I know it's not like you're totally against Bitcoin, which is cool to see, but you're definitely just as cynical in this space as you would be in other spaces, in crypto generally, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong, but in October, when Bitcoin was just over 121,000, I think is when I heard you say this. You issued a warning, which I later found out that you'd been saying that for about 2 months. You were saying crypto winter is just around the corner. And at one stage you said, historically, something pretty bad happens right about now. And I think the very next day, something pretty bad happened. And later on, by mid-November, Bitcoin had wiped out all of its 2025 gains. So first question on that, what were you seeing that the market missed?
What I was seeing was the halving cycle, and we're now in the fourth iteration of this. A Bitcoin halving happens after every so many blocks are mined. The payouts to Bitcoin miners get cut in half. And the last time that happened was in April of 2024. And typically what happens in any given moment, the most of the selling pressure in Bitcoin is Bitcoin miners selling the Bitcoin they've mined in order to cover their power costs, their capital costs, their labor, all their various expenses. So when you get a Bitcoin halving event, all of a sudden the miners are making half as much as they used to. The price is still relatively the same. So you get a lot of miners just go under. They don't have as much Bitcoin to sell anymore. They start borrowing. They do various things in order to stay up front. But that selling pressure gets alleviated around the halving. And that typically starts the FOMO cycle. And the anatomy of a FOMO cycle is pretty predictable. The price starts to rise a little bit, keeps rising. Some people start to notice, they start buying, the price starts to steepen a little bit. Eventually that rising price starts to turn into euphoria. And that's when everybody goes home, talks to their uncle at the holiday, and then they all come back and buy Bitcoin on Monday. The price goes vertical. When the price starts going vertical, inevitably the fraud starts. The crooks come out of the woodwork. Your infinite money glitches, your treasury companies. The last cycle, it was FTX and it was Terra Luna. It looks a little different every time, but the smell is the same. And so this time around, it was the treasury companies was the form that this euphoria took, where everybody's like, oh, all we do is we issue stock, we borrow money, we buy Bitcoin, Bitcoin goes higher, we can issue more stock, it works great forever, right? No, it doesn't work forever. And the last 3 cycles, Bitcoin hit its peak between 75 and 77 weeks after the halving. And it's been like almost to the day 3 times in a row now. And so 75 to 77 weeks after the April 2024 halving was roughly end of September, beginning of October this year. And so that's why I said, historically, this is the onset of crypto winter. And I don't think this time is different. I see a lot of similar things happening, like with Strategy and some of these ridiculous treasury companies. You know, you have companies that were on the brink of bankruptcy, and then they decide they're a WorldCoin treasury company the next day, and their stock rallies 1,000%. Quintessential bubble behavior. Yeah. And so I said, typically the top is in. Like, this would be the top. And so I started selling my Bitcoin in the middle of September, anticipating that top in early October. I still own a little bit of it. I'm not a Bitcoin bear. I'm also not a Bitcoin maxi. I do think Bitcoin has a place. I don't think the Bitcoin story is over. I do think this winter is just getting started. We still haven't seen the big event that takes us way down. Even though Bitcoin has seen some pretty substantial losses here, there hasn't been an FTX. There hasn't been a BitConnect or a OneCoin or a Mt. Gox yet. So I do think that is right around the corner. And for all, it could be the AI bubble that takes crypto down this time, because a lot of the Bitcoin miners have gotten into the AI data center space. Yeah. And so maybe they go down hand in hand. But I do think Bitcoin is in for a rough couple of months. Now, the silver lining here, the interesting thing is that typically the bottom for Bitcoin is that same 75 to 77 weeks before the next halving. And based on when the next halving is supposed to take place, that would mean roughly, I wrote it down here, I think it's roughly beginning of October of next year would historically be circa the bottom. So, interesting. You know, there's always guys who are going to be like, Bitcoin's going to be $1 million by lunchtime. You know, those guys are out there. They're on TV and everything. I see a very predictable, repeatable cycle. As the cycle happens over and over again, it is getting diminished. Like the moves are not as big as they used to be, because the halving events don't have the same effect they used to. When you cut something in half so many times, eventually the difference becomes less prominent. Yeah. But it is, I think it still is beholden to this halving cycle. And that's really what drove that call.
Interesting. It's definitely one of those assets that you wouldn't let go of completely. I know that you've liquidated or you've lose a bit of your holding in Bitcoin, but it's something that you'd still hold. Is it something that you see as it has a permanent place in your long term portfolio, or is it something that you kind of more or less just trade in and out of?
Yes, it does have a permanent place in my portfolio. It's as far out on the risk spectrum as I go.
Cool.
I used to work in nuclear power. I'm a very careful guy, so
Yeah.
I try not to be too risky. Uh,
Yeah.
but I do think it's still very much a new thing. It's still very much the Wild West, and so you do have to be careful. Most of the people who went west chasing gold ended up in the ground, horribly so, during the gold rush.
Yeah.
Uh, but there's also some interesting things like this, this BRICS movement right now and this effort to de-dollarize.
Mm.
And there is nothing in the world even close to the dollar for a means of trade settlement. Nothing comes close.
Mm.
There's the euro, there's the yuan. Nobody is going to trade food for oil or steel for food. They still need a reserve currency, and that's the dollar.
Mm.
And historically, the only things that or the things any reserve currency, it has to be a strong store of value. It has to be a medium of exchange. Bitcoin doesn't quite meet that yet as far as a store of value. It's still too volatile, but it is getting less volatile over time, still with a long way to go.
Mm.
Issued by a dominant economic power doesn't really matter because Bitcoin doesn't have an issuer. It's managed by its member network. So that doesn't really affect it as a means of international trade settlement. It's not dominated by any one central bank. Typically, the reserve currency is backed by the rule of law in a deep market center. Uh, Bitcoin operates based on its code.
Yeah.
You'd have to fork the network to change that. So it meets that criteria. And then the fourth quality of a reserve currency is having the military strength to back up your currency and enforce your trade network. That one doesn't really have. Again, you could argue Bitcoin doesn't need a navy, but it comes closer than anything else. And
Yeah.
a lot of people think there's going to be this BRICS gold backed currency is going to come and dethrone the dollar. I look at Russia trying to finance an endless war with money printing. I look at China dealing with a demographic collapse and a real estate crisis, and they're also trying to finance endless war. These are not the kind of countries that give away their power willingly. And when you go on a gold standard, you give away your power, your
Yeah.
ability to loot the public treasury.
Yeah.
So I just don't see that happening.
Right.
I could see gold becoming a reserve asset for central banks, and it actually is happening right now. Central banks around the world are buying gold, but as a means of trade settlement, there's no currency that works. I could see a scenario where Bitcoin begins, if it solves its volatility problem, which is still going to take many years. I could envision a scenario where Bitcoin is used for international trade settlement, with gold being used as international bank reserves. And if the world is serious about de-dollarizing, nothing else comes close. And that's still years out.
Right.
But as far as everything else, Bitcoin still has fraud problems it needs to overcome, and that's not really a Bitcoin problem. That's the people around
That's
Bitcoin.
right. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah,
No,
but
you're
I
right.
do have a
It's,
place for
it's
it
never
long
it's
term.
never often the asset itself. It's usually always the hands that hold it, right? And that's why I think going back to where we started, right? Clearly, it's not the problem of the actual US dollar itself. It's the network, right? And
Correct.
and you get dodgy hands trying to grab stuff all the time. So you alluded to before the fact that you used to be a nuclear engineer, right? And so no formal finance background whatsoever. You also said that you know what it's like to go to bed not knowing what you'd eat the next day. So at some point you went all in on YouTube and investigative reporting. Tell me a little bit about your backstory. Like, why did you end up setting up this YouTube channel, Nobody Special?
Yeah, my career path has been not your standard path, and certainly not a straight line. I was a knucklehead in college. I came from a middle class family. My parents were hard workers, did right by me and my brothers and sisters, put us all through college. And like the knucklehead I was, I partied and I was chasing girls around instead of studying. So I squandered the opportunity my parents gave me in my last year of college, and I had to fix that on my own. I had to go out and do that. So you know that's hence the going to bed not knowing what you're going to eat. I was on my butt. I was living at a friend's house, sleeping on the floor. When a buddy of mine that I knew from high school, who ran a commercial fishing boat, kicks me in the stomach one morning, said, hey, a-hole, you want a job? I said, yep, I'll take it. knowing knowing what I was in for, I thought I knew what I was in for. I went to work on a commercial scallop boat for a couple of years for him, and that saved my butt. It almost killed me. It was rough work. It's the hardest thing I ever did was get on that boat the second time. I had no idea what I was in for the first time I went out on a commercial fishing boat. The second time I did, that was rough. But eventually I got over my seasickness a little bit, and I was able to be a member of the crew. Made a good living doing some really hard work. Was able to go back, put myself back through college, and finish the degree I had started on my own terms. Got out of college, hated my first job, went right back on the boat with an engineering degree in my pocket. One too many crying voicemails from mom during rough weather when I come home from a trip and have mom crying on the voicemail. With an engineering degree in my back pocket, it was time to go to settle down. Plus, that life ages you too quickly. I had to get out of that in my 20s when I could. So I started on monster.com. I applied for a job at the local nuclear power plant. And as it happened, I was interviewing to replace a girl who had pretty much a mental breakdown in the middle of a refueling outage. A refueling outage at a nuclear plant is a pretty intense month-long operation. They shut down the plant and you go on shift work. You're doing 12 to 14-hour days, no days off around all week long until the reactor is refueled. You do a lot of upgrades and maintenance work during these outages, and they're difficult times, especially if you're on night shift. And the person I was replacing had just like abruptly quit in the middle of a refueling outage. That was it. She was done. And so the guy that was hiring to replace her happened to keep his sailboat right across the bay from where my fishing fleet was out of. He knew the guy who owned the fleet, knew the guy who owned the boat, knew what it entailed to work on the boat. And he's replacing a girl who couldn't handle 12-hour days. And he's like, a commercial fisherman with an engineering degree, that's my guy. I'll take him.
Yeah.
So, which was lucky because I didn't have to talk about my grades at the job interview, because that was very lucky for me. Yeah. I was good at nuclear engineering. I did that for a couple of years. Did a couple of other jobs at the nuclear plant I wasn't particularly good at, wasn't really that excited about the paperwork and the red tape. My plant that I worked at, where I met my wife, we were both employed there, was forced to shut down by the state government in 2018. And so we were lucky enough to land on our feet. When we ended up working at the corporate office, I was much more comfortable with the equipment and working in a production environment than I was at the corporate office. I don't say things I'm told to say very well. I don't read from a script very well. And you can imagine in a corporate environment, I really didn't thrive. Then 2019 comes around, Repo Madness that we talked about. I discover financial YouTube, make a lot of money shorting the market. I see they turn on the money printers. Obvious conclusion, buy gold and silver. Gold and silver do really well. Then the silver squeeze happened in 2021, which is when I made my first video on Reddit. Was all about silver. Was very well received. So about middle of 2021, I decided to start my YouTube channel. And I really enjoyed that. And by the middle of 2022, I was spending most of my day working on YouTube and doing just enough to not get fired at my corporate gig. This was all during work from home. And my supervisor at the time was a really nice guy. I had a lot of respect for him. And I just told him, I can't do this to you anymore. Like I was like, not quite quiet quitting. I mean, I was doing just enough, but my heart wasn't in it anymore. And so I made the leap. I decided I was going to go full time on YouTube. And there's been some lean years since then, because YouTube is not a particularly lucrative endeavor, but I haven't worked a day since. I love doing this. I really enjoy it. So, hopefully this sticks.
Well, when you say you haven't worked a day since, you're absolutely one of the hardest workers I know on YouTube. That's for sure. So what is next for Nobody Special Finance? You're just going to keep on trucking down the YouTube path, diversify? What's your thinking?
Yeah, I'm still on YouTube. I start putting out more stuff on Spotify. I'm expanding to other platforms and things like that. I have a guy helps me out with my research. I have a couple of moderators help my channel out, but for now it's still, pretty much a 1.5 man operation. I'm going to stay the course there. I like what I'm doing. It enables a good quality of life with me and my daughter. So
it's good.
I think I'll stick with it for now.
You should. No, well, thank you very much for what you do out there. I certainly have been getting a lot of value over the last few years. So if people want to connect with you and find out more, is the best place just go to Nobody Special Finance on YouTube, or is there somewhere else?
Yep, Nobody Special Finance on YouTube. Actually, I dropped the finance on YouTube. I'm just Nobody Special on YouTube now.
Fair enough.
Nobody Special Finance on Spotify, and I'm also on Twitter, JG_Nuke on Twitter, or if you just look up Nobody Special Finance, you'll probably find me on Twitter that way too.
Cool.
But my email's on there. Yep, absolutely.
Perfect. I'd love to see a few more tinfoil hats walking around here, the streets and this part of the world. So that's cool. Awesome, Jack. Thank you again very much for your time. Appreciate it. We'll catch you next time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you.